Good morning and welcome to the Space Madness Podcast. My name is Jeff Nosanov, and today we have with us Anthony Longman, who is a architect and a NASA Innovative Advanced Concepts Fellow, and a person with some very interesting goals professionally. So I'm excited to talk to him, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So it's a couple of interesting places where we could start. I'm fascinated by architects entering the space industry because I've known a few, and obviously the laws of physics that hold buildings together are the same that hold, space structures together. But before I go back and kind of ask how you got here, I'd like to give you the floor to introduce Skyframe and what you're currently working on.
Okay, Jeff, thank you. Skyframe research basically is about a single idea that occurred to me probably around 2012, something like that. And in a few words, it's the idea that we might be able to conceive and make an expandable, shielded, rotating space habitat. And the point about the expandability being that you could start with a small seed structure and expand by adding layers around it without ever losing control of your pressurized atmosphere. And that would allow you to start building a structure that ends up being really large. 1G at 2 RPM is quite large. But it wouldn't break the bank to begin. And that's really the key behind this idea.
And it wouldn't be room by room the way the space station was built.
No, it would be at every stage, it would be fully open interior, rotating circular profiles so that you can get development of synthetic gravity through rotation. And you'd have a full spacious interior, not subdivided except at the edges. You'd have a large interior space, and eventually you'd be able to grow landscape trees and have something that actually feels almost like a residential subdivision, if you see, in space.
Sure.
The idea of having something that felt like suburbia in space.
Yeah, and well, certainly in the show notes, we'll have the website and some of the materials so people can see. It's a fascinating idea. When I first started to wrap my mind around the way the system expands, I was thinking about those construction cranes that build themselves. Sort of, not a great analogy, not a perfect analogy, but as opposed to building rooms onto rooms, the way
Exactly.
yeah, the way.
Interestingly enough, even though the idea occurred to me in a sort of concept form, way back in 2011, 2012, it took 8 or 9 years to actually come up with what you will see on the website. And it's just because there were so many other ways you might try to do this, and none of which actually worked. And it was only in, I'm going to say, 2018, thereabouts, that I started to get a sense of what the shape of it should be. And it's basically a hexagonal cross-section.
Okay.
And it took another year or so before I finally had all the mechanisms starting to come together.
Well, this is one of my favorite kinds of stories to tell is these inklings that come to us, and we kind of can't get them out of our heads, and we keep working on them until we have to stop. And some of my favorite projects have started like that. So with that brief intro, let's take it way back. Tell us where you're from. What's your first memory?
Well, I grew up in inner suburban London. My earliest memory, you will really get a crack up from this, is I was asleep in a wheeled perambulator. I was out in the garden. I can't have been maybe 18 months, 2 years, if that,
Really? Okay.
I got buzzed by a bumblebee.
Wow.
Within a foot of my face, and I screamed blue murder because I was terrified. But that is the earliest sort of vivid memory that I have.
So that is fascinating for two reasons. One, that's a very young first memory, but also to know what pram is short for. I was aware that pram is what they call baby strollers in England, in the UK and England, but I didn't know. So that actually makes sense for it to be short for perambulator. So
yes.
Now I know.
It's a lovely
Now,
word.
not just a quirky, British saying, actually makes sense. Okay. So you're from London. I'm curious, when did you first have an inkling that architecture might be your field?
Well,
yeah. And take as long as I fascinated by architecture in general. So take your time and telling the story, whatever comes to you.
Well, I grew up, I had a younger brother, 2.5 years younger than me, and my parents provided us with a table tennis table in our playroom. And we didn't play much table tennis, but what we did is we would put sheets over the table so it became a house inside. And then we would sort of turn over chairs, armchairs, turn them upside down, and then put sheets over. And anyway, we just sort of, that I think was probably the origins of wanting to control space. And that's
I love it.
It's an interesting verbal analogy, control space.
Yeah. No, I really, that's a really interesting way to express it. I actually have distinct memories also from childhood of a ping pong table of my two grandfathers. On the rare occasions they were in the same room trying to build a ping pong table at the home I grew up in, at least until I was 12 or so. And I remember watching which is, it's strange to me it stands out because we also had card tables that had those struts that would fold out. So I don't know why this would stand out, but just watching a ping pong table come together, maybe because it was heavier, and seeing the structure necessary for it to fold up, I can totally relate to a fascination with that structure. Very interesting. So, but again, getting out to controlling space, a really interesting way of phrasing it. That would also be a great domain name for an architecture firm. And I can imagine putting sheets over the net post, creating a triangular, enclosed space. Very interesting. So
then I would have to also say that the other thing that sort of fed this was building model airplane kits, plastic model airplane kits, and then later on building the same things out of balsa wood and tissue paper that actually could fly. And I remember in particular one glider, I was into gliders, and it had a 51-inch wingspan.
Wow.
It was really quite big. It was as big as I was. Given the right sort of starting point, a little bit of elevation, it would fly for about 100 yards. You just toss it off.
Wow.
Fly downhill for about 100 yards, and it was just so graceful.
Tissue paper wing.
Yeah. Anyway, the thing about building models like that is they almost always come with plans, show you how it's supposed to be. And I think that's probably the springboard that led eventually to architecture.
I see.
Plans and working with plans.
Okay, so where did you study architecture?
I spent a total of 5 years at Cambridge University, a 3-year undergraduate degree. Then there was a year out and a two-year postgraduate. Cambridge is a very, very beautiful place, full of great buildings too.
So is that I'm aware that the U.S. is one of the only places where people get 4-year degrees and then do years more. So is that 3-year program kind of like a condensed by American standards? You do 3 years of basics of general stuff and then mostly architecture?
I think that maybe, and I'm not absolutely sure about this because I'm not truly familiar with the American educational system firsthand, but I think there may be 1 year more in what would be high school here.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Before the university thing. Yeah, I'm guessing, but I'm not absolutely sure about that.
Okay.
But I loved studying architecture, and I was particularly, some people go for big buildings. For me, it was residential architecture all the way.
Okay.
Houses, places to live.
I'm inclined to connect that to the experience you shared with a ping pong table and your brother, is that just a romantic notion?
It is.
Okay.
I've always loved houses, and that was where my professional career went.
Okay.
Totally focused on that. The other thing that was interesting was that in between my 3rd and 4th years of university, I took a year out, and I think it was then I actually attended the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. They have a landscape architecture graduate degree program under a Scotsman who's now gone, of course, Ian McHarg. But he was one of the first people to think about, he wrote a book which my dad bought for me, and that was what led to that. He wrote a book called Design with Nature. And he was sort of about ecological design, basically. He was one of the early people who understood that we had to go that way. Because, of course, with the habitat, what you need is an ecosystem to keep it all
Yeah. Well, that brings my mind to the Freeman Dyson idea of a space station grown from plants or a tree or a wooden structure that grows itself, something like that. I couldn't do it justice now, but the idea of taking advantage of the biological processes that create structures, large, strong, robust physical structures. So
Right.
very interesting stuff. So you design. So when did you come to the U.S.?
Okay. I fell in love with a series of American tourists, girls in England. And so after the end of my first year at university, I went out to the U.S. on a student visa to visit one of them. Of course, the romance blew up immediately. But I spent almost 4 months in the U.S. that year. And I fell in love with the whole country. It was my first visit to the U.S. You have to understand, growing up in England is still kind of, well, when I was growing up, it was still kind of very class structured, working class, middle class, upper class. And that really didn't set well with me, even though I had the benefit of growing up middle class and a good education, but it didn't feel right. And being in this country for 3 or 4 months, it just felt how it's supposed to feel, and so I knew I would be back, but it took me about 10 years to back on a permanent basis.
See, that's a really interesting observation. I mean, what year was that you came to see this?
It would have been 1969, I think.
Okay.
About that.
Well, the obvious question for this podcast would be, did that have anything to do with the Apollo program in 1969?
Heck yes. I mean, I was so excited by all of that.
Okay.
I have one sort of step back to my childhood. When I had an Eagle comic subscription, and the front page was Dan Dare, who was a colonel in the Space Forces, whatever it was at that point. And he had a sidekick called Digby. So that was, I had a buddy who was also interested in space, and we drew spaceships just on pieces of paper with pencils, and they were detailed designs with cross sections, with floors and all that.
Yeah.
So it was in my blood fairly early.
Okay. Interesting. So, well, I guess you just answered my next question. Did you have a thought then that someday you would be involved with NASA, or was it a goal? I imagine you were focused on houses at the time.
I really did not. It's so funny. I came over to the U.S. in 1980, I think, and this idea about doing something focused on space didn't really show up until 2007.
Okay.
This is 25 years or more later. And
well, it sounds like you also had, that was the core years of your career.
Yes,
as well.
Residential architecture.
You were busy, yeah.
Yeah, and I had my own design practice. I did about 30 house remodel plans, something like that, in California. Then when my wife and I met, we moved up to the mountains north of Los Angeles at the bottom end of the Central Valley, about 6,500 feet. We were living there. This would have been 2007, 2008. And we were on the side of a valley fairly high up. And there was this sort of almost semicircular profile of the valley. It could have been a glacial profile. And it was filled with trees. And it was just this image of a semicircular surface covered with trees. And that's what really started me thinking, how do we make this in space? How do we do this? That was the origin of the search, the serious search for a way to do that.
I can see that landscape in my mind, and it actually reminds me of 50s and 60s era science fiction drawings of I almost want to say pre-2001 A Space Odyssey science fiction drawings of these space stations with, as you said, bucolic 1950s small towns in them. And when I think about those, actually, one thing that kind of demarcates that era of science fiction is that the space outside the space station in those images is lit, is light, as if it was floating in the sky and not in space itself. And I don't know whether that was a stylistic choice at the time, but it just really rings in my mind like that, maybe drawn that way to seem familiar or achievable by being in the air as opposed to in space. But anyway, so
one of the curious things about space is that it looks black, but it's absolutely filled with light.
Yes,
very intense light.
Yeah, and all kinds of things, and not just light. Yeah, I mean, what part of one of the initial space missions ever was to go and catch some of that stuff, light and otherwise, and see what's actually going through there. I wonder if you maybe have a photo of that scene of that landscape that we could use for the image of the podcast for the banner, but we can talk about that
Absolutely, yes,
later.
I do.
Oh,
And I
great.
wanted to, and I just didn't have time to
Okay.
ask you about this, but I wanted to have this as a backdrop.
I haven't done a lot of that in the editing, but I can
That's okay.
poke around and I can see what's an option. But it's clear that that image is very significant to you. And so I want to work with it if I can. But so, okay, so it sounds like you were maybe approaching a traditional retirement age. You saw this out your window or out your front door and you thought, oh boy, I gotta run this down.
Yeah, it's interesting. Oh gosh, I don't want to try to calculate the numbers. It was, what are we now, 2025? About 18 years ago, maybe, when this started to kind of cross my thoughts. So I was still at the latter end of my normal career path. But this has grabbed a hold of me hard.
Well, it was also around I wonder if it had anything to do with the NASA events at the time. It was around the time of the space shuttle ending. The space station itself was more or less complete. It would be a logical assumption that you were thinking about the next.
Yeah, the other thing I
version.
think is, I think that the perception of the world was filling up with people. It was starting to register the population of the planet, what we were doing to the planet, all of that, the sort of ecological concern about the biosphere and all of that also played into it. I kind of sometimes think about this as a potential lifeboat technology for the planet, as well as sort of a pressure valve, if you like. There's two different ways of thinking about it. We are probably a generation or so away from reaching the maximum population of the planet, and then it's starting to decline. One prediction I heard was about 2060, maybe 2080. Not an exact focus on this, but it's clear that the developing world has an average birth rate of, I think it's 1.6 children per woman capable, and the replacement value is 2.1. So the developed world is already in population decline. In sub-Saharan Africa, the number is still 4, and that's, but the point is we are heading to a very significant change in the population dynamics for the planet. Whether we will know how to handle it well, it remains to be seen. But I sort of think of this as somehow a moderating factor one way or the other.
Well, so you started to have this idea and you got this goal in mind. What was your first step, coming from a residential remodeling perspective? How did you, when you decided, okay, I got to work on this, what was next? I mean, I know how that would work from NASA people, but you weren't involved.
It took, I think I started thinking about this, and then maybe a year or possibly 2 years later, I heard about the NIAC.
Okay.
And somebody mentioned it to me. It took me a year or two. In the process, and I forget exactly how this happened, I met a professor, Bob Skelton, who was in San Diego, I think, close at that time, as part of the California university system. And he was interested, he was developing tensegrity structures. And he actually he was the first person to write the math for how you can engineer tensegrity structures. Nobody knew how to do it until he discovered the math. He invented the math in 2010. That was about the time I was thinking about space structures.
Okay.
We met, and he became my partner on the Phase 1 NIAC. And on the Phase 2, I was the PI on the Phase 1. And on the Phase 2, we switched, and he was the PI. But he played a big part, a big role, and I will always be grateful to him. He's gone now. But I will always be grateful that he saw the potential of the idea and sort of decided to partner with me. So much kudos to him.
So I'm trying to think of how to discuss tensegrity structures without visual aids for the listener. I'll back up and I'll expound briefly on the NIAC program. That's the NASA Innovative Advanced Concepts Program. And it's basically, if you imagine what a 6-year-old thinks of what NASA does, that's it. Crazy space ideas that may or may not work, funding and resources to explore them in an initial stage, and some of the most interesting work that I've been involved with. So now it's a very small percentage of what NASA does, but it is what little kids think NASA does. And I just love that. So I want people to keep that in their mind. But a tensegrity structure. So I'm trying to think of how to explain that, or how to paint a picture of it. But
Well,
you're the guest, so I'll ask you to do that
yeah,
first.
I can add a little bit there. It's
Yeah.
basically in a tensegrity structure, there is no bending involved. They're pure compression and pure tension. And in the case of,
Okay.
and there's a number of ways it can manifest. So one of the simple ways is like 3 sticks in a sort of a spiral configuration with 9 strings holding them together. So none of the sticks touch. They are only held by tension cables. And it sort of
Oh.
bounces a little bit when you drop it on the floor because of the tension. And there's another, but it's not, that's not the only possible version of it. If you think about it, a balloon is also a tensegrity structure because there's pure tension in the surface, and then in the gas inside, there's pure compression, and there's
Interesting.
no bending forces per se. It's pure tension or pure compression. That's basically the one way of defining a tensegrity structure. There's no bending at all in the pure sense of it.
So distinguish that for me from a traditional structure and where
Well,
the bending might be.
yeah, I mean, if you think of the point being, I think the point is that the structure is most efficient because the rigid parts don't have to resist bending. They only have to resist compression.
As opposed to, let's say, the beam in the room I'm in holding the floor above me,
which has to
is
handle bending
a little
as
bit.
well. And therefore, there needs to be more physical mass there to handle the bending.
Ah.
That's why tensegrity structures are, you and I, almost every living thing is a tensegrity structure of some kind because it's the most efficient way that nature can engineer things. You know, we have compressive bones and tensile tendons and muscles, and it allows us great freedom, you know. So they are amazingly versatile structures, but they are very, very efficient in terms of the use of mass.
So I'm thinking of a single-celled organism which has a pressurized inside of some kind of fluid and other structures, and a membrane or something holding it in.
Yeah, tensegrity is nature's way of doing things.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's much better than anything I could have come up with. So I want to go back to your first example of a tensegrity structure: 3 sticks held together with
9 strings.
tension cables without touching each other, with 9 cables, but 3 sticks only have 6 ends.
3 sticks have 6 ends, but each end of a stick is the anchor point for 3 tension cables.
Oh, okay. Okay.
That's how you get 9.
Like this. People are either going to subscribe to my podcast or unsubscribe forever after being forced to imagine that.
Is there some way we can add in a picture of one of these?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I'll have to figure that out. No, but I just like the idea of people listening and going, like, trying to wrap their mind around that. No, that's great. So when I was imagining it, it was my first exposure to tensegrity structures was this rover concept. I want to say it was from Jeff Landis at NASA Ames, but it might not have. I don't remember, and I'm sorry, Jeff, if I'm misattributing in either direction. But basically, it was a rolling rover.
Yes,
it was a ball.
So the simplest version, the 3-stick version, is like a spiral configuration of 3 sticks, but you can have more sticks than that, and it's still a tensegrity structure as long as they don't touch each other. The sticks must not touch each other. That's the rule. They're always connected by tensile cables.
And they could be stored flat, and then tension and dropped on Mars. Okay, I remember this now. Yes. Okay.
And they can unfold. They can change shape by changing the length of the tensile cables.
Well, that reminds me of this toy called the Hoberman sphere, that you toss it up in the air and the centripetal force expands it. I don't know if it's a tensegrity structure, but it's
probably.
Yeah. Speaking of tensegrity structures, the cat is probably also a tensegrity structure.
Yes, well, we all are.
Yes. Yeah. So I actually not connecting the cat to NASA directly, but connecting that. I remember the tensegrity structure-based space systems were actually one of the things that got me interested in learning how NASA actually chooses missions. Because I remember when I first read about that, I thought, well, this is cool. What would it take to do a mission where we drop 100 of these things on Mars from orbit? Because they could probably hit the ground without breaking. I mean, we did that with the Spirit and Opportunity rover landing bags. If something that big can. So that was the introduction to the bureaucracy that chooses how missions are done and the way that technology readiness levels are evaluated. And so I now know the answer, which would not be nearly as exciting as the rest of this podcast. So I'll spare the listener. But getting back to your NIAC, the NIAC process. So you did a phase 1 and phase 2, and for the listener, that's basically exploring on paper mostly the basic ideas of an approach to solving a problem. And there are other steps within NASA to mature ideas past the paper into the lab and so on. But we quickly run into the question of the way the world chooses space stations, right? The way space station architectures are identified, developed, and what it even takes for a nation to commit to a space station in the first place. Did you ever feel like it was an almost impossible dream to say, okay, well, here's this new idea for a space station?
Well, that's a really interesting question. As you know, the NIAC program has a phase 3 NIAC, which actually I and my engineering collaborator, I'm going to step back a moment. One of Bob Skelton's students actually became a junior professor in his own right and is now at the University of Kentucky. And he and I took a run at a phase 3 18 months back from today. Is a 2-stage competition, a step A and a step B. We didn't get through step A because one of the requirements is you have to have a potential interested flight partner, and we couldn't get that together soon enough. So we did submit the proposal, but it was doomed. By that. Sure. But in our Dear John letter that the administrator of the NIAC program wrote to us, he gave us a nice compliment. He said that, what was it? A potential paradigm shift were his words. So that was a nice thing to hear.
Yeah, and that can also feel like a curse, honestly, because when someone at NASA tells you this is a brand new way of doing things, you think, oh boy, now I have the full inertia of NASA working against me because it's a new way of doing things. And this is not a new problem. Institutional inertia is common everywhere, I'm sure. But I don't know. I've always found that to be motivating. If in the way that Da Vinci designed a helicopter, right? It took a few hundred years, but his idea of flying straight up was pretty good. It just took a while.
Yes, yeah.
So hopefully it won't be that long, but it does start to bump up against global issues of geopolitics and bureaucracy and corporate lobbying for companies who are already building space, so it catapults you into a very interesting world that's much more than just the architecture itself.
Yeah, it's very competitive.
Yeah, and not just for the reasons you'd hope, for
exactly.
Efficiencies and cost savings. And that gets into a larger discussion of the future of the space station as we have it and what's coming next. I find it very interesting the way different companies are approaching it. There's one company called VAST that's basically building it already and counting on being able to sell it. And there's other companies like Blue Origin who have their orbital reef thing, and they're trying to sell it before they build it. So someday there'll be a very interesting story told about how the successor to the International Space Station was developed.
Yeah, it's interesting because everybody knows that we have to do this, and yet it's very hard to do.
Yeah, and it kind of calls back to the motivations for the space station in the first place, which was actually less technical and more geopolitical, and wonders if the current geopolitical environment would support such an international project again, or if the various commercial applications for microgravity real estate, for lack of a better word, whether that would motivate it itself. And so where does that fit into your thinking?
Yeah. Well, it's very difficult. It's very hard. The one part about this idea, our idea, the one part about it that gives me some hope is the fact that you can start with a very small piece and grow it in stages incrementally. And if you can make each stage kind of self-supporting economically, if you can find some way to use the real estate in a way that creates value, then just maybe that would allow this to emerge. And because it's can be the growth principle, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is life got started and it was, very hard and sort of very much subject to random forces and chance and all of that. But once it got started, it eventually succeeded. And I'm sort of thinking about this a little bit the same way, that I think it will be able to get a start, and that I think that it will prove its value on a sort of demonstration basis, I think. The fact that this is a good way to go,
Yeah, it almost raises the question of, how did we arrive at the default way we build everything else right now, like the house that I'm sitting in. There's a beam right here that's holding up my I guess that's my dining room, and that's been done that way for 10,000 years, I assume, since humans first built structures. And now there may be an alternative, but there's all kinds of reasons why we do things a certain way, and not all of them are engineering based. I wonder, what would a residential home look like as a tensegrity structure? Has anyone ever built such a thing?
Well, we have the sort of beginnings of that, the dome houses.
Okay.
That came out of the hippie movement. So to speak.
See. Okay.
Those are kind of a step in that direction. Because a dome is a geodesic dome is a very efficient way to enclose space, and sort of half or 2/3 of a dome is an efficient way if you have to you're subject to a gravity field. So yeah, you don't build the whole dome, you build most of it and you sit it on the ground. That's an efficient, very efficient structure. And I have to say, I think I would like to live inside a dome house at some point.
Yeah.
Just for the experience.
Well, and I'm picturing just a Roman arch, just to go way back, as a section of a dome with the same structural optimization of a curve supporting, although that is definitely subject to bending forces, right? So perhaps not the best example.
Well, but it's a balance between all of those forces.
Okay, interesting.
It's amazing that the Romans were able to build. I forget the name of the structure, but with a big dome, that was pretty astonishing.
Parthenon? Is that the Parthenon?
And then there were the medieval, or no, later than medieval, but where they had big domes on the top of the churches. Just amazing.
So that goes to, I think, a really interesting kind of longer term historical subject, perhaps that we can close with some thoughts about. So I'm aware that prior to modern engineering with analytical tools, builders, not engineers, but builders, they used a sort of ratio system where they knew, or they had learned from trial and error, someone had prior to them had learned from trial and error, that if you wanted a church, for example, to have a ceiling that was yay wide, you needed to have supports that were a certain height and width, and likewise with arches and other kinds of structures. And I find that sort of to be an interesting kind of historical through line, where people for many hundreds or thousands of years were using ratios instead of, calculus to design structures, many of which still stand today. And as you mentioned, Bob had to develop the math for tensegrity structures. Yes. I wonder if that will someday be seen as in the same line of construction, historical.
Yeah, I kind of think so. I'm sort of jumping sideways a little bit from that, but I mentioned that I spent 4 or 5 years in Cambridge, and there are some very old buildings there. There's a King's College Chapel, I think dates from perhaps the 1500s, something like that. And it's an example of I think the Gothic style of building churches, and it's very high on the inside, maybe 3 or 4 stories high, and it has pillars built into the wall, and then from the top of the pillars there are these sort of branching beams that look like the branches of a tree almost. They're all, I think it's called a fan vault, and the best way I can describe it is like the intersection of my fingers here, in each direction going back down to a column. It's almost like a tree, the branches of a tree in the structure from each of the columns. And it's incredibly beautiful, as well as being a very efficient use of stone. provide an arched roof, and it's beautiful, and it's sort of mathematically elegant and perfect as a compressive structure. So I mean, every approach to structure ends up with a very pure manifestation that has its own beauty.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking also about the aqueducts that the Romans built, some of which are still standing.
Yeah.
Just amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, and the one other thing that sort of this touches on is, can we learn to build structures in space that are maintainable over a span of centuries? You don't want to just throw it away after 30 years. You want it to be able to be maintained and sort of self-renewing over a long period of time. And that has its own interior logic and dynamic that we've barely sort of begun to think about. And one of the other things is, because once you get outside the Earth's magnetic field, you're subject to all this bad radiation. You're going to have it shielded, and the shield then has to be expandable if you're having expandable structures.
Sure. Well, I think you
want a long-term structure, therefore it must be protected very well.
Well, as tangential as that might have seemed, like, actually, I think it brings some really interesting thoughts to mind as we close our episode. So I'm reminded of my understanding is some of the Roman aqueducts and some of the other ancient structures, they used a certain limestone that actually, my understanding is it actually self-heals to some degree when exposed to water. I wonder if that won't someday be an inspiration for future structural maintenance in space with some material that responds to the incoming environment. And certainly the need for these sorts of spaces, whether a Roman Colosseum or a medieval cathedral or a future space habitat, I mean, these are central themes throughout humanity. So
maintainability.
Yeah, efficiency and maintainability, and certainly with much more immediate consequences in space if not fully evaluated. So I think we're gonna close this episode with this wide open thought of how do we begin to imagine long-term, sustainably maintainable space structures.
And the key thing, the key perception that I came to eventually is that this protection against radiation is the sort of fundamental driver, because it's so omnipresent. And you therefore have to have a very strong, dense exterior structure, which in the case of the expandable habitat, that shielding structure also has to be designed for expandability. So that drives the geometry very, very strongly. Then inside, you can have a structure that you can maintain because it's not subject to the full force of that radiation load. And because it's fully protected from that, you can then start to wrap your arms around the maintainability of the pressure hull inside.
I hope I'm not imagining this, but I believe the Parthenon actually has a dual not a dual roof system, but a similar pair of structural elements.
I know where you're going.
Yes.
I know where you're going. Yeah.
So I think that's a beautiful analogy to close this episode on, that have an outer and inner ring.
Yeah, an outer and an inner,
something like that.
Some of the domed church structures have an inner dome and an outer dome.
Yeah.
And a space between where a maintenance worker can actually go.
Yeah. So I think we're going to leave it there, challenging the listener or viewer to come up with some of these solutions and maybe even propose them to the NIAC program. And again, one of the reasons I wanted to do an episode with you was, you entered that world from architecture completely separate from NASA.
Right.
So I want to show that that's doable, with creative ideas. In fact, not just doable, but critical, to bring insights from other fields without being clouded by NASA bureaucracy and the way things are done. So with that, I think we'll close the episode. I want to thank you for your time, both you, Anthony, and the listener. And we'll keep working. There's certainly no shortage of problems to solve. Thank you.
It's been a great pleasure, Jeff. Thank you. Take care.
Likewise.
All right.